In this video, I want to give you a simple tip to help you improve your biomechanics so that you can get more power on both your forehand and your backhand, whether you use a two-hander or a one-hander. So I'm going to explain what the biomechanical tip is, the thing that you should focus on during your practice, and then we're going to give it a little bit of context because sometimes there might be other things that are limiting you and things that you need to work on before you focus on this. So the tip itself is to think about timing and using your hip to initiate the stroke. Hitting powerfully in tennis is a combination of sound biomechanics and timing. So for sound biomechanics, what we're thinking is using our full kinetic chain, so starting with big muscles and then leading to small muscles. So if I'm doing a neutral stance forehand, I'm preparing by rotating my upper body, by turning my pelvis to the side, by twisting my belly button into this back leg, and this is going to load the big muscles so that then I can create racket head speed by driving through my hip first, then my torso, then my arm is going to come through afterwards. It's exactly the same on the backhand. So if I hit a one-hander, it's the same principle, looks a little bit different. So my single-hander, I'm rotating my upper body, I've got my pelvis pointing to the side, I'm rotating my belly button in towards this back hip, I'm going to drive through the hip and the legs, then the torso is going to kick in, then my arm is going to come through to contact. It's going to be the same thing on a two-handed backhand. I rotate, is my racket up there? Is it there? There's a few different options of where it could be, but my torso is rotated, my pelvis is rotated, I'm driving through this back hip, then my torso rotates, then my arms come through after. So that's the kind of the biomechanical side of things. The other thing that goes along with that in terms of creating power is the timing. For most shots, we're going to want to meet the ball slightly out in front of the body. So if I'm hitting my forehand, I'm probably going to want to make contact with the ball somewhere there. Depending on the height, depending on your grip, it might be a little bit different, but a little bit in front of the body. Same thing on the backhand, a little bit in front of the body. So the power comes from a combination of the biomechanics, using that kinetic chain in sequence, and the timing. But a lot of players, they still think about their arms too much. They're focusing on their arms. And instead, what you want to focus on is the back or outside hip. So if I'm a right-handed player hitting a forehand, I'm going to be thinking about throwing this hip forwards. So thinking about this movement. And you can watch yourself back on camera afterwards. You definitely want to record yourself to see whether you're doing it. Do you actually throw the hip forwards? So do I start with my pelvis and my hips pointing this way, and I finish with my hips pointing that way? If you're not doing that, and I'm not making contact with my pelvis kind of pointing more in that direction, then you're not using your hips effectively. And you might want to think about kind of throwing it forward. So I could think about trying to bring that forwards. You might want to think about ripping a belt buckle to your left. So I'm imagining I'm wearing a belt and it's just a different coaching cue. As the ball's coming, I'm thinking about just ripping that to the left to help me get it. You might want to think about pushing your leg into the ground and driving yourself forwards. So there's a few options of what you could think about, but the principle's the same. We want this to initiate the swing, both on the forehand and the backhand. So forehand, neutral stance, this is initiating the swing. If I'm doing an open stance, this is still initiating the swing. I'm still throwing it forehand and throwing it forwards. And then as I go to the backhand, if I'm hitting a single-hander, I'm still going to throw that hip forwards. If I'm hitting a two-hander, I'm going to throw the hip forwards. If I'm hitting from an open stance, I'm going to throw the hip forwards. Open stance two-hander, I'm throwing that hip forwards. So the simple tip is to think about throwing the hip forwards, and you have to think about doing that in relationship to the flight of the ball. A lot of players hit the ball late, so you need to think about starting this hip drive maybe a little bit sooner than you were expecting. So now that we've talked about the biomechanics and the importance of initiating your strokes by thinking about driving the back hip forwards at the right time relative to the flight of the ball, we need to address the elephant in the room and say, is this what you should actually be focusing on, or are there bigger priorities? In part, it's going to be what you should be focusing on. You have to understand the technique, you have to have an idea of what you're doing, but we can only focus on so much, like, properly at any one time. So what you need to do is you need to record yourself and figure out where things are going wrong. Because for a lot of players, yes, they're not driving through their back hip, but the reason that they're not driving through the back hip is because they aren't able to, because they didn't prepare properly. Tennis always starts, hopefully, with a split step depending on your level, footwork, movement to the ball. As you're moving to the ball, you're doing that upper body unit turn. You're finalizing what happens with your feet to help you kind of get more balanced and just finalize and get you the right distance from the ball. And as I'm doing those final portions of the movement, I'm rotating into that back hip. I'm making sure that my upper body unit turn coil is finished, and that then allows me to do the stuff that we described earlier. But for a lot of players, they're not preparing properly. They don't split step, they don't react quickly enough, they don't set up the right distance from the ball, they don't get an initial unit turn and loading of the hip. And if you don't get those things in the first place, it's irrelevant whether you're then driving through the hip, because you're just thinking about driving through the hip, because you won't be able to do it. So you've got to look at it in context, you've got to record yourself and figure out what you should be focusing on, and you've got to work on that. So what I've explained is important biomechanical concepts that you want to keep in mind. But if you aren't doing a split step, or you're setting up too close to the ball, or you're not recognizing the short ball and moving forwards, or not recognizing the deep ball and moving backwards, most of your focus needs to go on that. And the reason that I'm emphasizing those points so much is because I get videos sent to me from a lot of players in a lot of different countries around the world, and the vast majority of the time the issues are to do with the preparation. The reason that players can't do the other more complex stuff is because the preparation is much less than optimal. So I wanted to mention this because it's really important to keep in mind. Now, if you are unsure what you're doing wrong and what you should be focusing on, that's something that I can help you with in my next Neuro Tennis Challenge. So this is a 5-day event where I teach you how to use brain-based training to improve your performance. And on day 1, we look at going through technique and figuring out what you need to focus on. So if you would like my help with this, I invite you to the challenge. There is a link that's going to be down in the description, or you can go to neurotennis.net/challenge. Also within that challenge, I'm going to be teaching you how to use brain-based training to improve vision and coordination, because that's one of the other things that's going to be really important for how well you can do all this stuff. In order to sequence your kinetic chain properly, it requires a high degree of coordination, and that's something that holds a lot of players back. And then in order to hit with power, in addition to using the kinetic chain properly, you have to start your swing at the right time. A lot of people start their swing late because they can't read the flight of the ball properly. So I find for most players to be able to do what they want to be able to do on court, you have to improve vision and coordination. So I'm going to be teaching you about that in the challenge as well. So if you'd like to join me, then the link will be in the description. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions about what I've covered here or any comments, leave them down below, and I'll catch you next time.